Dear students, today we are going to continue with lecture number 11 of psycholinguistics, and I'm going to give you a brief briefing of what we've gone through already, and we're going to continue that a little bit, further getting to know what psycholinguistics basically was. In the previous lectures, I gave you a briefing of how the sounds are produced. Now, today we are going to start with a little bit more of going back in the history again, just to refresh your memory. So, psycholinguistics have long been interested in language. The psychologists, the people who study the psychology, and psycholinguists are the people who study language through the study of the brain. Now, psychologists have been long interested in language, but psycholinguistics as a field of study did not emerge until 1960s. Now, that was clear because we had already discussed that in previous lectures. It was motivated by Chomsky's work in linguistics. So Noam Chomsky was a very famous linguist, and this was motivated, psycholinguistics was motivated further when he worked in the field of linguistics and developed different branches of it. And by his claim that the special properties of language require special mechanisms to handle it. So Chomsky's, you can take a reference in 1959. So what we want to see is that his claim was that special properties of language, some different types of language, they require special mechanisms to handle it. So it's a proper way that you have to go through to learn a language. The special feature of language on which Chomsky focused was its productivity, how we produce language. So Chomsky's focus was basically on the production of language. Possessed with a grammar or syntax, humans can produce and understand novel sentences that carry novel messages. So once a human being has the knowledge of sentence structure, which is syntax, or how to structure the words, and a proper knowledge of grammar in English language, they can produce, and they can produce proper English language, and they can understand proper sentences also, and understand different messages. Now, we do this in a way that is exquisitely sensitive to the structure of the language. So, for example, now we interpret the empire helped the child to third base, that was a book, and the empire helped the child on third base as conveying distinct messages. Now, although the sentences differ in just one small word, you see, the basic of these two sentences would differ only from one word. What? The empire helped the child to third base, like the empire is helping the child, empire ne child ko help kiya third base tak, or the empire helped the child on third base as conveying distinct messages. Now, these we know that he showed her baby the pictures, and he showed her the baby pictures. एक और सेंटेंस का आपको ये एग्जाम्पल दिया जा रहा है. Now he showed her baby the pictures. That means like the contents, if you don't structure the sentence properly, the context of it would change, the meaning would change, and the person listening to you or perceiving those sentences might perceive it in a different way. So the understanding of that person might be a little different. It all depends on how you structure the sentence or how you use the grammar. So he showed her baby the pictures. That means like what we would implement from that, or what we would guess would that he showed the baby the pictures. But he showed her the baby pictures. That would change the context completely. Now, just by changing a few words, moving them around, we can change the meaning of the sentence. So he showed her the baby pictures. That means like he's showing her pictures of the baby. So you see, there are two different things, two different meanings coming from the same sentence. Now this describes quite different events. Both of them are describing different events, even though the difference in word order is slight. So the difference in word order is very slight. You see, he showed her baby the pictures, he showed her the baby pictures. You see, all he did was change baby and the. He changed both of the places for that. And by changing that one single word, he changed the whole context of the sentence and the whole meaning of it, changing the event completely. So we can even make some sense of colorless green ideas, sleep furiously. That was from Chomsky's 1971, which is semantically anomalous but syntactically well formed. So you can make some sense out of it, out of the colorless green ideas, sleep furiously. You can check that as a reference from one of Noam Chomsky's books in 1971. And maybe you can see that how well it was structured or how well it was formed. Now the same kinds of abilities are found at other levels of language. We combine morphemes, units of meaning. Now morphemes would be units of meaning in systematic ways. And so we understand Lewis Carroll's 1871 to 1977, that was also a reference of Lewis Carroll, slithi, tovs, to refer to more than one tov that has the characteristics of slithiness. So, agar hum reference mein check kare, so we would understand the meaning of the systematic way, how slithy tovs, and refer that to more than one tov. That means that we're talking about more. And that has characteristics of slithiness. Now we can combine phonemes. Phonemes are units of sound according to the patterns of our language. Accepting slithi, but not slithi as a potential English word. So we accepted slithi as a potential English word, but tilithi has no meaning. It makes no sense. So in English language, that would be a meaningless word. Now, early psycholinguists described our comprehension and production of language in terms of the rules that were postulated by linguists. Now, Fodor, Bever, and Garrett, 1974, is a reference of that. The connections between psychology and linguistics were particularly close in the area of syntax. So, the relation between language, linguistics, and psychology. They were close in the structure, in the area of structuring of sentences, with psycholinguists testing the psychological reality of various proposed linguistic rules. So at that point, the psycholinguists were testing different psychological, they were taking the psychological reality and they were testing it with different linguistic rules. Now, as the field of linguistics developed, it became clear that theories of sentence comprehension and production cannot be based in any simple way on linguistic theories. So one thing is clear, that as the field of linguistics developed, when we moved on, when they kept on researching in this field, it became clear that theories of sentence comprehension, how you understand a sentence, and the production, how you produce a sentence, cannot be based simply on linguistic theories. So it's not all about, like, the understanding and the production is not all about just the theories. Now, psycholinguistic theories must consider the properties of the human mind as well as the structure of the language. So once again, we come back to the same point, which is the main point, that psycholinguistic theories must consider the properties of human mind. So not only just the structure of the language, but they have to consider how the mind or how the brain comprehends the language. Now, psycholinguistics has thus become its own area of inquiry, informed by but not totally dependent on linguistics. So psycholinguistics is an area of inquiry. It is become its own. It is informed, but it's not totally dependent on linguistics. It has some parts of linguistics in it, but psycholinguistics is its own study on its own. Why? Because when we differentiate the structure of language from linguistics would be the structure of the language into psycholinguistics, that means that the study of the brain and how the brain comprehends the language, or how the mind would understand. A human mind would distinguish language. So psycholinguistics wouldn't be dependent on linguistics just. They are two different things. Now, although Chomsky and the early psycholinguists focused on the creative side of language, language also has its root side. So even though they were focusing on how the creation of language started, or how language was created, and who started language as a base, but they also, language had its own root side also. Now, for example, we store a great deal of information about the properties of word in our mental lexicon. So what we're doing is, like, this is related to our permanent memory, our working memory, and our mental lexicon. So, for example, like, we are gathering information on a daily basis and about different properties of words, and we are storing that into our mental lexicon. And we retrieve this information when we understand or produce language. So what we are doing is, like, if you try to understand your brain as being a big, huge, deep store where you're storing language, you're gathering, it's like an archive, you're gathering different informations about words and the properties of words and how language is. And then when you want to produce the language, when you want to speak about something, or you want to maybe understand something, you retrieve that from your lexical mental lexicon, from that memory, and then you use that information. So on some views, different kinds of mechanisms are responsible for the creative and the habitual aspects of language. So some views would say that different kinds of mechanisms, different ways, different methods are responsible for the creation of language and the habitual aspects of language. The habitual aspects would be when you, it's sort of, we create a habit when we want to produce, we retrieve words or sentences from our memory, the knowledge that is stored there permanently, and then habitually we would just apply that, either in the production of language or in the understanding of language. Now, for example, we may use morpheme-based rules to decompose a complex word like rewritable the first few times we encounter it, but after several exposures, we may begin to store and access the word as a unit. So once again, a reference of Karamazov, Lodana, and Romani in 1988. They did a research on this, and Skruder and Payne in 1995 continued that research. So you can check that as a reference. But the example that they say that, for example, that we may use morpheme-based rules, so we will take the meaning-based rules to decompose a complex word, or to dispose of or separate a complex word, like rewritable. Now, the first few times we encounter it. Rewritable would be a word that we, if we want to, the first time we would see it, we would say, okay, now what is this word? And then we would use morpheme-based, trying to understand the meaning of that word by separating the different structures of that word. And after several exposures, we may begin to store and access it as a unit. So sometimes, maybe in the start, we'll say that rewritable, what sort of word is that, and try to understand the meaning and differentiate the difference between writable. But after some time, when we keep on seeing that word again and again, then we start storing it. Our brain starts storing that word as a full unit into our memory. And so next time whenever we see it, then we will immediately recognize it. Now, dual route views of this kind have been proposed in several areas of psycholinguistics. Now, according to such models, frequency of exposure determines our ability to recall stored instances, but not our ability to apply rules. So, according to these models that they've created, that the frequency of exposure, that means that the more we are exposed to a certain word, gives us or determines the ability that we have to recall those instances or remember them, and it doesn't apply to the rules. It's not about our ability to apply rules. It's just about applying it to our memory. Now, another idea is that a single set of mechanisms can handle both the creative side and the rote side of language. So sometimes another idea is that a single set of mechanisms, just simply we would take a few, that can handle both the creative side and the root side of language. So that's only sometimes. Now, connectionist theories, you can see Rumpelhardt and McClelland in 1986 take this view. Now, such theories claim, for instance, that readers use the same system of links between spelling units and sound units to generate the pronunciation of novel written words like tov and to access the pronunciation of familiar words. So what does these theories claim? They claim that, for instance, a reader is using the same system of linking between the spelling units. Like we are linking that connection, making a connection between the spelling units and the sound units to generate pronunciations. So we take the sound units and we take the spelling units. We have been given a word tov. Now, if we don't understand the meaning of that, but we can see that we've taken the spelling unit of TOVE and we've used the sound units and we've created the word, and we can pronounce the word of novel written words like tov and to access the pronunciations of familiar words also. Now, be they words that follow typical spelling to sound correspondence. This would be why? Because how can we distinguish the sounds and pronounce it properly? Because we follow the typical spelling to sound correspondence, or things that we've already know that are related to a similar pronunciation, like stove. Now, stove, we already know that as one word, so pronouncing tov would not be difficult for us. Or words that are exceptions to these patterns, like love. Now, for example, Plott, McClelland, Sederberg, and Patterson in 1996 made a research on that, and then Sederberg and McClelland in 1989, once again, they had done some research on how the words are linked. Now, in this view, similarity and frequency both play important roles in processing. So similarity and frequency, they both play an important role in processing, with novel items being processed based on their similarity to known ones. So both of them are important, but they are with the novel items that are being processed based on their similarity to the known ones. That we already know the words stove and love. So then it's very similar, tov would be very similar, so it would be very easy for us to memorize that word or store it in our brains. Now, the patterns are statistical and probabilistic rather than all or none. Early psycholinguists, following Chomsky, tended to see language as an autonomous system, insulated from other cognitive systems. That means like it was on its own an autonomous system, and it was insulated, it was separated from other cognitive systems. Now, in this modular view, you can see J.A. Fodor in 1983, a reference. The initial stages of word and sentence comprehension are not influenced by higher levels of knowledge. So in this you can see that the initial stage of word and sentence, understanding, comprehension, or comprehending a sentence, they are not influenced by the higher levels of knowledge. So information about context and about real world constraints comes into play only after the first steps of linguistic processing have taken place, now giving such models a serial quality. So information about context and about the real world constraints comes into play, that means comes into focus only after the first steps of linguistic processing have taken place. So as soon as we take the first steps of processing language, then by giving such models as serial quality. So serial quality would be a model, and we would process language by that. Now, on an interactive view, in contrast, knowledge about linguistic context and about the world plays an immediate role in the comprehension of words and sentences. This also is a very important point, that on an interactive view, if we look at it as an interactive view, in contrast, knowledge about linguistic context, what the material of linguistic languages that we know, and about the world, and about our society or the world, that plays an immediate role in understanding different sentences and words. So in this view, many types of information are used in parallel with the different sources of information working, cooperatively or competitively, to yield an interpretation. So what does this do in this view? Many types of informations would be used side by side with different sources of information. We're getting different sources of information working either cooperatively, that means in sequence with it, or competitively, or as a competing for it, to yield the interpretation, to yield the understanding or the meaning of it. Now, such ideas are often expressed in connectionist terms. So some of these ideas would be expressed in connectionist terms. Modular and interactive views may also be distinguished in discussions of language production. So modular and interactive views, we can distinguish them in discussions and how we produce language, where one issue is whether there is a syntactic component that operates independently of conceptual or phonological factors. So only we can distinguish the discussions while producing language only when there is one issue that its syntactic component, the structure of the structural component that operates independently of conceptual and phonological factors. Now, another tension in current day psycholinguistics concerns the proper role of linguistics in the field. This is a major concern nowadays. It's not just about the study of psycholinguistics, but how the current day psycholinguistics concerns the proper role of linguistics in the field. Now, work on syntactic processing, on the structuring and processing, especially in the early days of psycholinguistics, was very influenced by developments in linguistics. So the processing or the structure of the processing long ago, when the research started in psycholinguistics, it was influenced. That means that it had some influence by developments, by the different, how linguistics kept on developing as a separate field. So links between linguistics and psycholinguistics have been less close in other areas, but they do exist. So in other areas, maybe their link wouldn't be that close, they wouldn't be connected to each other, but they do exist. There is some connection. For instance, work on phonological processing has been influenced by linguistic accounts of porosity, the melody, rhythm, and stress pattern of spoken language. So you would say that if you would go according to phonological processing then, which is influenced by linguistic accounts, Prosody would be the melody, rhythm and stress pattern of the spoken language, how it sounds, what are the sound effects, what is the rhythm of maybe saying a sentence, and how we put stress on different patterns of languages or different words. And that stress is the emphasis on spoken languages. So it is influenced by that, and of the internal structure of syllables, also by how the words are structured, and some work on word recognition and how we recognize the words. And language production has been influenced by linguistics, analysis of morphology, the study of morphemes and their combination. So psycholinguistics would, morphology would also be a part of psycholinguistics in the way that they would study the internal structure of the syllables or the words, and some work on word recognition has been done also, and language production, how we produce the language. And all of that would be influenced by analysis of linguistics, and that would be analyzed through the method of morphology. Now, morphology is the study of the morphemes and their combination, how they are combined. Now, although most psycholinguists believe that linguistics provides an essential foundation for their field, some advocates of interactive approaches have been moved away from a reliance on linguistic rules and principles and toward a view of language in terms of probabilistic patterns. Also, for example, Seidenberg in 1997 did a research on that. So although most psycholinguistics believe that linguistics would provide an basic foundation for their field, like for psycholinguistics and social linguistics and whatever. So in psycholinguistics they say that linguistics does give a base to their field. Some would advocate it as interactive approaches have moved away from a reliance on linguistic rules and principles. And they've like sort of moved away from the linguistic rules and principles and towards the view of language in terms of probabilistic patterns. So in this we describe current views of comprehension and production of spoken and written language by fluent language users. So in this what we would do, we would describe the current views of how we understand the language, how we produce the language of spoken and written languages, and by people who are fluent in that language. Now, although we acknowledge the importance of social factors in language use, our focus is on core processes such as parsing and word retrieval that are not likely to be strongly affected by such factors. So we've studied about parsing already in our previous lectures. So although we do acknowledge that the importance of social factors in language use are important also, that would relate to social linguistics. But our focus is on the core processes such as parsing and how we retrieve the word from our mind, and that are not likely to be, they're not likely to be strongly affected by such factors also. Now, the important field of developmental psycholinguistics. Now, and that's developmental psycholinguistics, which deals with the acquisition of language by children. We also studied that, how children acquire the language. So the important field that would also be a part of psycholinguistics, but we've given that part a different name, like, because it once again is a very detailed study. So they have separated it from the simple psycholinguistics into developmental psycholinguistics. How psycholinguistics is developed and how children acquire the language. Now, neurolinguistics, how language is represented in the brain. That is very closely related to psycholinguistics also. Neurolinguistics would represent how the brain would understand or represent the language. Now, applied linguistics, which encompasses such topics as language disorders and language teaching. Also, once again, applied psycholinguistics is another field of part of psycholinguistics also, and it covers the topics of how disorders of language are dealt with and how do we teach language. So we move on to language comprehension then. Now in language comprehension, spoken word recognition, the perception of spoken words would seem to be an extremely difficult task. Speech is distributed in time, a fleeting signal that has few reliable cues to the boundaries between segments and words. So first of all, we would go with spoken word recognition, how we recognize the words spoken. Then the perception of spoken words, so how we perceive the spoken words, would seem like a very difficult task to understand how we perceive every single spoken word. But then speech is distributed in time, a fleeting signal that has a few reliable cues to the boundaries between segments and words. So we've sort of divided speech into different time sectors by saying that to see the distances or the boundaries or the limitations between segments and words. Now the paucity of cues leads to what is called the segmentation problem. So, or the problem of how listeners hear a sequence of discrete units, even though the acoustic signal itself is continuous. Now other features of speech could cause difficulty for listeners as well. So not only that, the paucity of the segmentation problem also of how listeners would hear a sequence of discrete units and then how they would understand it, and how the signal itself continues. There are other features of speech also that could cause difficulty for listeners to understand the spoken language and how to comprehend it. Now certain phonemes are omitted in conversational speech. Now we do omit some of them from our normal speech. Others change their pronunciations depending on the surrounding sounds. So some of them would change the pronunciation, the sound of how we produce the word by combining it with another word. So for example, N may be pronounced as M in lean bacon. So in lean bacon, maybe it would sound more like an M instead of an N. And many words have everyday pronunciations. For example, going to frequently becomes gonna. Now, like I had explained to you in previous lectures, that going, we would change going into gonna, that I'm gonna do this or I'm gonna do that. That would change the word into a slang. Going would be the proper word and gonna would be the slang. Now, despite these potential problems, we usually seem to perceive speech automatically and with little effort. So when we do know a language, it's very easy for us to perceive it or to understand the language automatically, and we don't have to put too much pressure or too much pressure on our mind to retrieve words, and it just automatically happens. And with very less effort on our parts, we can distinguish the different words. Now, whether we do so using procedures that are unique to speech and that form a specialized speech module, again a reference of Lieberman and Mattingly in 1985, or whether we do so using more general capabilities. So either if we do it by unique to speech and for specialized speech modules, or we could use it through general capabilities. It is clear that humans are well adapted for the perception of speech. So listeners attempt to map the acoustic signal onto a representation in the mental lexicon, beginning almost as the signal starts to arrive. So listeners attempt to map the acoustic signal. That means that they sort of make a mental map in it, onto a representation in the mental lexicon, beginning almost as the signal starts to arrive. As soon as we get the signal, of that language, then our mental lexicon starts beginning to distinguish that signal and trying to understand and then retrieve from our memory recognition of that certain word or sentence. The cohort model, now first proposed by Marlson, Wilson and Welsh in 1978, illustrates how this may occur. It explains how this would happen, that according to this theory, the first few phonemes of a spoken word activate a set or cohort of word candidates that are consistent with that input. So what does it do according to this theory? That they would take the first few phonemes of a spoken word and take the start of it and then activate a set of cohort of words or similar words, candidates that are consistent with that input or that would be similar to the meaning of that word. Now these candidates compete with one another for activation. In our brain, this process is going on when we are competing to retrieve a word or trying to understand it. Now these candidates compete with one another for activation. Activation means like how you retrieve the memory or how you memorize it. As more acoustic input is analyzed, candidates that are no longer consistent with the input drop out of the set. So candidates that don't make sense, they would drop out of that set, and then we would retrieve those or focus on those that make sense to it. Now this process continues until only one word candidate matches the input. So all of this process is going on in our brain and in our mind so fast that it's going in milliseconds. We even don't realize by sometimes when we're speaking, somebody would say something and we are trying to understand what the person is saying. All we have to do is just, we are processing those words so fast in our mind to comprehend and make a match with the input. So the best fitting word may be chosen if no single candidate is a clear winner. So we would choose any word from our brain and our mind or our memory, and if we can't exactly distinguish that word or if we haven't heard that word before. Now supporting this view, listeners sometimes glance first at a picture of a candy when instructed to pick up the candle. So Alapina and Magnuson and Tenehauses, they did an experiment in 1998 in their research work, and they had shown some listeners a picture of a candy, and they had told them immediately to pick up the candle. So when the listener, they're seeing the picture of the candy and they're being told to pick up the candle, they would confuse the word candy and candle, you see. So our mind would immediately, because we've seen the picture of the candy, our mind would immediately distinguish that as the major word, and when we listen to the sentence pick up the candle, then immediately we would refer to candy as the first point of word retrieval and what we know, and later on if we pay attention, then we see that it's a different word that they're saying. But our first impression would go towards candy instead of candle, and we would automatically go and pick the candy up. Now this result suggests that a set of words beginning with KN is briefly activated. So all the words that begin with K and N, they will all be activated all at once in our mind, in our brain, and then we sort of start retrieving those words. Now listeners may glance at a picture of a handle too, suggesting that the cohort of word candidates also includes words that rhyme with the target. So maybe a listener would also glance at a picture of a handle because candle or handle, they rhyme, even though they're two different things, but just because the sound of it is rhyming. So the listener will immediately maybe look at the picture of a handle also. So when he's trying to comprehend either a picture of candy or a picture of a handle, and then because he's been told so quickly that pick up the candle, now he'll maybe think, oh, he's telling me to pick up the handle or pick up the candy. So we would have those both perceptions in our mind, just because we might think that candle has a close reference and sort of rhymes with handle. So that would create a confusion. Now, indeed, later versions of cohort theory in Marsden and Wilson in 1987 and 1990 have relaxed the insistence on perfectly matching input from the first very phoneme of a word. So in their research, they have relaxed the insistence on that it cannot be perfectly matched on the first phoneme of a word. We cannot judge a word by just the first phoneme. So other models of McLeland and Ellman in 1986, Norris in 94, also advocate continuous mapping between spoken input and lexical representations. So they would also, these other models would also, they would sort of help us in understanding in mind mapping between the spoken input and the vocabulary or the lexical representations of the words, with the initial portion of the spoken word exerting a strong but not exclusive influence on the set of candidates. So by doing that, they would be exerting a strong but not an exclusive. They would create an influence on the set of the candidates who are listening by doing an initial portion of using half of the spoken word and then seeing how the spoken input and the lexical representations would match. The cohort model and the model of Cleland and Ellman are examples of interactive models. So those in which higher processing levels have a direct top-down influence on lower levels. Now, in particular, lexical knowledge can affect the perception of phonemes. So in particular, your vocabulary or the vocabulary knowledge can affect the perception of phonemes. A number of researchers have found evidence for interactivity in the form of lexical effects on the perception of sublexical units. So a number of researchers have gone through this and they found evidence for the interactivity in the form that the lexical, the word, how the words affect us, and on the perception of sublexical units also. Worm and Samuel in 1997, for example, reported that listeners' knowledge of words can lead to the inhibition of certain phonemes. So, and they reported that the knowledge would be that it could lead to the inhibition of certain phonemes also. Now, Samuel in 1997 found additional evidence of interactivity by studying the phenomenon of Phenom Ik Restoration. So he found some more evidence related to this, related to interactivity, by studying the phenomenon of Phenom Ik Restoration. Now this refers to the fact that listeners continue to hear phonemes that have been removed from the speech signals and replaced by noise. So maybe we can create noise, and the phonemes that are removed from the speech, let's say like as in the word tove or stove, that the listener would still continue to hear the word stove, even though the S has been, the phoneme has been removed from that word, and it has been replaced by noise. So we would, even though we would say tove, the listener might perceive that as stove. So Samuel discovered that the restored phonemes produced by lexical activation lead to reliable shifts in how listeners labeled ambiguous phonemes. So Samuel discovered that if he had restored the phonemes, if he had recovered them, the phonemes that are produced by the activation of words, it would lead to reliable shifts in how, shifts that means is how they comprehend, how the listeners would label the different ambiguous phonemes, how they would differentiate or how they would shift between those. Now, this finding is noteworthy because such shifts are thought to be very low-level processing phenomenon. So because it's noteworthy because these things are considered to be very low-level processing, that it processes it at a very low level. Now, modular models, which do not allow top-down perceptual effects, have had varying success in accounting for some of the findings just described. Now, the race model of Cutler and Norris, 1979, you can see also Norris, McQueen, and Cutler, 2000, is one example of such a model. Now, the model has two routes that race each other: a pre-lexical route, which computes phonological information from the acoustic signal, and a lexical route. So this model would have two routes. One would be phonological, that computes pre-lexical route that computes phonological information from the acoustic signal to and the other would be the lexical route. Now, the lexical route in which the phonological information associated with a word becomes available when the word itself is accessed. So only when we access the word does that information become available to us. Now, when word-level information appears to affect a lower-level process, it is assumed that the lexical route won the race. So even though when we're seeing this, that when word-level information appears to affect at a lower-level process, then we would say that it is assumed that the lexical route has won the race because we understand that at a better level, or the word level of information is stronger than the lower-level process. So importantly, though, knowledge about words never influences perception at the lower phonemic level. So it will never influence the perception of lower level phonemic. Now, this is currently much discussed about whether all of the experimental findings suggesting top-down effects can be explained in these terms, or whether interactivity is necessary. So there has been so many discussions and so many experiments trying to find out that can we explain the interactivity in this sense, or we can just explain it by these terms, or do you think that interactivity is also necessary? So you can see Norris et al. 2000 and the associated commentary also for a reference. Now, although it is a matter of debate whether higher level linguistic knowledge affects the initial stages of speech perception, it is clear that our knowledge of language and its patterns facilitates perception in some ways. Although it is a matter of debate, so we still debate about it, many people, many researchers debate about it, that maybe a higher level linguistic knowledge would affect our initial stages of how we perceive language or speech. But it is also clear that our knowledge of language and its patterns would facilitate the perception in some ways. For example, listeners use phonotactic information such as the fact that initial TL is illegal in English to help identify phonemes and word boundaries. So that would be one example that listeners would use phonotactic information. So you can check that out also on Fraudlein and Monier in 1998. Now, as another example, listeners use their knowledge that English words are often stressed on the first syllable to help parse the speech signal into words. Once again, we would say that this is another example that maybe in English words, the first syllable is more stress has been put on it. Like, even I do that. You can see that when I'm saying more stress, so I'm putting more stress on the S word, the start. on the first label, and that would help us to the speech signal, putting that into words. Now these types of knowledge help us solve the segmentation problem in a language. So we can use this type of knowledge to help solve the segmentation problem in a language that we know. Now, even though we perceive an unknown knowledge, unknown language as an indifferentiated string, so even sometimes we can use this knowledge to understand the meaning or some problem in a language that we don't understand, or to perceive maybe an unknown language that is in as an undifferentiated string, like in a sequence, and sometimes we use that to try to understand what is being said. Printed word recognition. Now, printed word recognition speech is as old as our species and is found in all human civilizations. So, when we would say that printed word recognition speech is an old as our species, like as long as human beings have been in civilization, our species we can recognize words since then. And sometimes printed word recognition maybe would be like that. But reading and writing are newer and less widespread. So reading and writing, or maybe speech, yes, speech sounds were found as far back in our civilization, but reading and writing were newer forms of the language, and they were less widespread. So these facts lead us to expect that readers would use the visual representations that are provided by print to recover the phonological and linguistic structure of the message. So when we are reading a book, let's say, these facts would lead us to expect that when we are reading a book, a certain page or a book, that readers would use the visual representation. The visual representation is when they are looking at the book, when they are seeing the words in the book. So, and those words that they are seen would be provided by the print in that book, would help them recover the phonological and linguistic structure of the message and try to understand the phonological and linguistic structure of language just by seeing the words in the print form. Now, supporting this view, readers often access phonology even when they are reading silently, and even when reliance on phonology would tend to hurt their performance. So sometimes even when we are relying on phonology, even when we're reading silently, at that point we often access phonology, trying to understand what we are reading. Now, it's not a must that we have to speak it out loud and say something verbally with making a sound for our speech. Even when we're going to be silently reading, we're still trying to differentiate the meaning of it. We're trying to understand the meaning of what we're reading. And even when the reliance on phonology would tend to hurt their performance, that means that even though it would hurt their performance, they're using phonology, but it might hurt their performance in reading the word, because they're trying to understand also at the same time while also reading it. So in one study, people were asked to quickly decide whether a word belonged to a specified category. Now, they made one experiment in which they were asked, like, you look at a word in a book, and then you quickly decide that whether it is belonging from a specified category or not. Van Arden performed this experiment in 1987. Now, they were more likely to misclassify a homophone like meat as a food than to misclassify a control item like melt as a food. So even though they are shown these two words, they would immediately, like they're telling you to classify this with some term. So they would see the word meat, and suddenly the thought of the edible food meat would come to their mind. But they can easily refer that to as food. But they wouldn't refer a word like melt as food, because that would have a completely different structure. So in other studies, readers were asked to quickly decide whether a printed sentence makes sense. So again, they did an experiment, and they were shown several sentences, like a reader is shown a sentence and they ask them to quickly decide. That means like in seconds they have to just look at it and then decide if whether this printed sentence makes sense or not, if it's properly structured or not. Now readers with normal hearing were found to have more trouble with sentences such as he doesn't like to eat meat than the sentence such as he doesn't like to eat milk. Now people with normal hearings, they were having more trouble with these sentences to distinguish if it made sense or not. He doesn't like to eat meat. Once again, meat, they have said the sentence by they're referring to eating the meat, but they're giving a different spelling for it. So it's very difficult to see if this sentence really makes sense or not. It doesn't make sense. And sentences like he doesn't like to eat melt, once again that doesn't make any sense. Melt what? So those who were born deaf, in contrast, did not show a difference between the two sentence types. So the people with normal hearing were having difficulty trying to comprehend it, but the people who were deaf or couldn't hear properly, they did not show any difference between the two sentence types. They couldn't distinguish the difference. So the English writing system, in addition to representing the sound segments of a word, contains clues to the word's stress pattern and morphological structure. So consistent with the view that print serves as a map of linguistic structure, readers take advantage of these clues as well. So the English writing system, in addition to representing the sound segments of a word, would also contain the clues to how we put stress on different word patterns and how morphological structure is used in forming a sentence. And it would be consistent with the view that print would, like if we are printing a word or let's say a book or sentences, it serves as a map of linguistic structure. So readers would take advantage of these clues as well. For example, skilled readers appear to have learned that a word that has more letters than strictly necessary in its second syllable, ete rather than et, is likely to be an exception to the generalization that English words are typically stressed on the first syllable. So in a lexical decision task, now where participants must quickly decide whether a letter string is a real word, they perform better with words such as cassette, whose stressed second syllable is spelled with et. Now they're not putting stress on the third one, but the second syllable is spelled ite. So cassette, et would be. So we're putting more pressure and more stress on the start of the word. Then let's say that the word, if we take another word as palit, which has final eat, but first label stress. So first label is important when we are speaking in English, that we always do put stress, trying to understand that we put stress on the first word, such as cassette. So et would be the same as in palette. So et would remain the same, but cassette would differentiate, or palette would differentiate the different words. So we're putting more stress on the start of the word. So skilled readers also use the clues to morphological structure that are embedded in English orthography. So for example, they know that the prefix re can stand before free morphemes such as print and do, yielding the two morpheme words reprint and redo. So for example, they would say that they know that the prefix would restand before free morphemes. Instead of, or such as in the print and do, they would yield the two morpheme words and reprint and redo it. So encountering vibe in a lexical decision task, participants may wrongly judge it to be a word because of their familiarity with revive. Now, although there is a good evidence that phonology and other aspects of linguistic structure are retrieved in reading, there are a number of questions about how linguistic structure is derived from print. So even then, we still see that there would be a number of questions of how we would distinguish it, or how we would say that a linguistic structure is derived from the print of a book or any written material. Now, one idea which is embodied in dual root theory, such as that of Coulthard, Russell, Perry, Langdon, and Ziegler, is that two different processes are available for converting orthographic representations to phonological representations. So a lexical route is used to look up the phonological forms of known words in the mental lexicon. This procedure yields correct pronunciations for exceptions words such as love. So when we were going towards Coulthard, when we were seeing how he presented stove and tove, even though OVE is represented in love too, but because we are putting more emphasis on the first word, so this would be an exception, and you can see how we pronounce the words. A non-lexical route accounts for the productivity of reading. Now, it generates, a non-lexical route would account for the productivity, that means the production of reading, and it would generate pronunciations for novel letter strings, for example as stove, as well as for regular words as stove, on the basis of smaller units. Now, this latter route gives incorrect pronunciations for exception words, so that these words may be pronounced slowly or erroneously. And love said as love in speeded word naming tasks would also be the same thing. You see, the pronouncing it. Now in written form, we would be doing it with an E, giving the end of the word by E. But we would we can pronounce it when we are speaking it fastly, or in speeded word naming, we would say love. So that would be LOV, just putting pronunciation on that and keeping the E silent at the end. So in contrast, connectionist theories claim that a single set of connections from orthography to phonology can account for performance on both regular words and exception words. So that's also given in a reference of Plot et al. In 1996, and another research in Sederberg and McClelland in 1989. Now, so in contrast, they would say that connectionist theories would claim that a single set of connections from orthography would to phonography can account for the performance on both of the regular words or the exception words, and they would count for both of them, how we pronounce those words. Now, but another question about orthography to phonology translations concerns its grain size. Now, English, which has been the subject of much of research on word recognition, has a rather irregular writing system. Now, for example, EA corresponds to I in bead, but E in dead, C in K, in cat, but S in city. You see, we are pronouncing these different words, but we are spelling them in a different way. So we are giving the sound of S in city, but we are using the word C, the alphabet C. So, for example, this would correspond, like in bead, we would use, we are writing E, but we're pronouncing I. Dead, E is pronounced. In C, K in cat. Now C is written in cat, but we would say it with the K, giving the K sound. Now such irregularities are particularly common for vowels. Now, quantitative analysis have shown, however, that consideration of the consonant that follows a vowel can often help to specify the vowel's pronunciation. And that is given as a reference in Kessler and Treeman in 2001, and in 1995 in Richmond Welty also. So the E pronunciation of EA, for example, is more likely before D than before M. So such considerations have led to the proposal that readers of English often use letter groups that correspond to the syllable rhyme. The vowel nuclear plus on an optional consonantal coda in spelling to sound translation. You can see Bowie 1990, Treeman in 1995 for supporting evidence also, that such considerations would have led to the proposal that English readers would often use letter groups to correspond. So in more regular alphabets such as Dutch, spelling to sound translation can be successfully performed at a small grain size, and rhyme-based processing may not be needed. So researchers have also asked whether a phonological form, once activated, feeds activation back to the orthographic level or not. Or so a word such as heap may be harder to process than otherwise expected, because its phonological form hip would be consistent with the spelling heap as well as with the actual heap. So some students have, studies have found evidence for feedback of this kind. For example, Stone, Van Hoy and Van Arden in 1997, but others have not. So Pearman, Content and Bonan in 1998. So because spoken words are spread out in time, as discussed earlier, spoken words recognition is generally considered as a sequential process. Now with many printed words, though, the eye takes in all of the letters during a single fixation. So when we're looking at a word, we would look at a word and we can read immediately all the syllables in it, just by glancing at one. So the eye would take in all the letters during a single fixation. So let's say the word, the connectionist models of reading cited earlier maintain that all phonemes of a word are activated in parallel. Now current dual root theories, in contrast, claim that assembly process operates in a serial fashion such that the phonological forms of the leftmost elements are delivered before those for the succeeding elements. So Coulthard 2001 is a reference for that. Still another view would be Berendt and Perfetti, is that consonants, whatever their position, are translated into phonological form before vowels. Now, students, that is enough for today, because we've gone through all the basics and how these different theories are applied to psycholinguistics. So I would like you to maybe, if you do have time, check out the references that I've given you. You can maybe understand it more easily if you will have more reference work to lead to trying to distinguish all this that I've explained to you today. So please do check out the references, and what I would like you to do is create your own understanding of how these theories are applied to psycholinguistics. So I think that is enough for today, and I'll see you inshallah in the next lecture. So take care. Goodbye.